It's my true honor to be here, and thanks colleagues and friends. I'm really delighted to have the chance to share with you some of my thoughts in regards to my recent ongoing research. And as you know, the more I do research in relation to the topic that I select, I must confess that the more I do research, the more I understand less, I have to do more. As a student of social sciences research, I must confess, I know so little. I would like to share with you some of my thoughts. I certainly welcome advice and comments from the floor, particularly a very distinguished group of colleagues today. And this is an ongoing project that I started in the last couple of years when we had a conversation with friends like Hill and Andy Green from UCL IOE talking about expansion of higher education in Europe. And we also find similar patterns in Asia, and that is what is the impact on social development and social policy. Particularly tonight, I want to focus on the labor market and also the graduate employment. So I certainly would say that this is only an overview of some selected areas in Asia. It's not meant to be exhaustive because I think there's a lot of work to go on. And then I won't go into the details about the data set tonight. I just want to give paint a picture about the overview about what happens in massification of higher education and its impact on labor market and graduate employment in Asia. Particularly, I want to cite one case about China, I think, for your interest. I think we cannot leave, ourselves without talking about whenever we want to contextualize about the studies today. We are living in the era of globalization, and take Asia is part of the most, rapid emerging economies in the world. People will argue that 10 years ago, people began to talk about the Asian miracle, but Asia that performed quite well, but it doesn't mean that Asia would not have any problem. And especially about 20 years ago, when Asia experienced about the first kind of regional crisis in economic downturn. And Asian economies in 1996 and 1997 experiencing about the economic downturn and realizing that without transforming the economic structure would be very difficult to compete globally. And at the same time, at that point, many of the East Asian economy has begun to think about the role of higher education by spending more on higher education, by expanding higher education. But when talking about expanding of higher education in Asia, it doesn't mean that this is driven by the state funding alone. Because I think the pressing demand in Asia in terms of people looking for education, particularly this is a deep down cultural belief. If you don't trust me, if you talk to people in Asia, particularly in China, Greater China area, parents, they would love to have the first consumption item is about spending money on students' education, their children's education. So some of the poor families, they really want to send their kids. In some Chinese villages, they're very poor. They even save up and mobilize different kinds of resources within the village to send their kids to university. It tells you about the importance. This is a cultural belief for sending the kids for university education with the hope that at the end of the day, they can get better opportunity in job and also social mobility. They also believe education, after having higher education, can bring glory to the family. It's a very heavy burden for their kids. Why I say so? Because this is very important to look into why education is so important in China or in the region. And at the same time, people spend more, but rather spending more on higher education, they would pay off in terms of returns this day, in having better opportunities in job search, and at the end of the day, they can really enjoy upward social mobility. It becomes a huge question now when university system has expanded and massified in Asia without changing about the cultural expectation, particularly about the occupational expectations of the families and also young kids after education in the higher sector. So this expansion has raised a lot of issues. In tonight's talk, I will focus on the expectation on labor market and what's then the social policy implication. As I mentioned before, after reflecting upon Asian financial crisis in 96 and 97, many of the Asian economies began to realize when they are transforming the economy into more knowledge-based economy, they need people to be educated. And these people to be well nurtured with high skills and also knowledge. So that's why they expand higher education by not only with the government funding. If you look into the East Asian systems, doing the comparative work in the region, you see that what constitutes to the expansion is not only the government funding. Certainly, government, in Asia do expand more. They spend more on higher education. But most important of all, I will argue, is to do with the private sector. We are talking about privatization and also marketization of higher education in Asia. And the private sources of funding, family contribution to education have played a very important part in higher education. And when people they spend more on higher education, whether they can get back the result as expected becomes something interesting to watch into the Asian systems. But higher education enrollment has been massifying. My friend, also worked in this part, talking about Europe. We found similar kind of unemployment or underemployment issue, like our colleagues working in the US, pointing out, nearly half of the students or graduate from university, they may not be getting job or they are underemployed. But at the same time, many of them, they face a condition that, university education could not find them jobs requiring the qualification that they need, because they are overqualified for the jobs. For the sake of argument, in the case of China or East Asia, we are also finding graduates, they do have jobs after graduation, but what sort of jobs, what kind of labor market we are talking about? So my work in Greater China area, I conducted, university student survey in Taiwan, in China, and also in Hong Kong. It is interesting that students delay the unemployment issue by enrolling themselves in higher education and postgraduate education. You see, so many students, they are embarking their learning journey in postgraduate studies in Greater China. It doesn't mean that they are really fond of education though, because they want to delay the process of unemployment. An interesting conversation when I interview students in Taipei, I keep on asking them, there are job opportunities elsewhere or perhaps across the strait in the mainland China, but many of them, they are very reluctant to move away from Taipei. Supposedly being a city, an international city of Taipei, and I would presume that students would be willing to go away. Why don't they go away? Because they think that they are well protected by their parents. Many of them, particularly for the public university or national university in Taiwan, many of those students and graduates, they come from a middle class family or even upper one. So that's why they are very reluctant to move away from Taiwan, despite the fact that opportunities might be available elsewhere. You come to the observation that it is interesting, there are jobs elsewhere, but they don't want to go for. They just look for jobs within Taiwan, but they keep on complaining. They complain President Ma Ying-jeou in Taiwan for, failing about, first of all, economic development is not that good as he promised. Second is the wage of graduates, comparing the 10 years later with the 10 years before, is flattened. But, my friends, property market has stood, it's rocketly high. When I work in Bristol University, everyone complained about the property market. I don't know what happens now. And Hong Kong in 1996 and 97 is hit up the property market and people want to cool down. But after changeover for more than 18 years now, the property market is even worse than before. You just imagine, with not a very promising future painted in terms of labor market, but with other things, like the property market consumption has become so expensive. You just imagine if you were the cohorts from Asia in major cities like Taipei, like Shanghai, like Hong Kong, like Seoul, they all complain about employment prospects. And this slide gives you the idea that the unemployment issue, particularly undergraduates or the youth unemployment. I want to contextualize that by qualifying this slide. Of course, comparing to Europe is nothing. So when I talk to friends in Europe, 3-4% is really nothing. But you look into China, if talking about 2 months after graduation, it's about 70% in urban area, and the undergraduate from rural area is about 30%. And in Hong Kong, people complain about youth unemployment is approaching 10%, 9%. But if you look into a different level, the associate degree student, they complained about the government for stipulating a policy early on after 1996 and 97 because of the economic downturn by encouraging students, particularly the private sector, to launch 2-year sub-degree programs for those students graduating from high school. But they found it, the more they invest in this privately run sub-degree program, but do not land them on, very good, employment prospect. Comparing the sub-degree, associate degree student with that of the undergraduate master one, you see about the difference. And in Taiwan, again, similar situation has come up, undergraduate about 6%. For Asia, my friends, I'm talking about Asia, most of the Asian economy do not expect to face about unemployment like this. And anything over 4% is already been alarming, especially for youth, people, young people in Asia. Singapore, when compared to other places, are better, but South Korea is about 8% youth unemployment under 30s. So, of course, when you put all these regional, figures together in Asia, when compared to Europe today, when I have friends, working in Spain and Greece, 40%, 50% unemployment rate is something. When I talked to my friends in Bristol last Friday, 25% about unemployment of university graduates. I don't know whether this is a very scientific data, but when comparing Asia with that of Europe is not very serious. But contextualizing that in Europe, in Asia, is something that the government has to cope with. So the position is a similar story as I mentioned. So in South Korea, about 3 million economically inactive graduates. In Japan, after 2 decades of economic recovery, but still very downturn. And we can see that people complaining in Japan about job opportunities. India, 1 out of 3 young graduates are unemployed. In China, it is hugely difficult to find accurate data. But according to the Ministry of Education, it's around 70% employment rate. I really doubt about this 70. Perhaps they count every kind of job opportunity, but a lot of job is a mismatch. For those students or graduate, they work on some job. Those jobs do not require university qualification. Might be the case. And there is putting all these figures together, there is coming to feature that emerging in Asia, people arise of the high skill but low paid job. In the old days, in Asia, they have to go out for overseas studies, but now they are having their local system offering high degree. But the more high degree, they are turning out students with high standard, but in the global marketplace, they are charging only reasonably cheap prices. I remember huge, when I invited you to give a keynote speech in Hong Kong, you mentioned about your conversation with one of the bankers in Singapore. And Singapore is being one of the global city recruiting people all around the world. They are looking for people in China, Thailand. You talk to me, it's a very good example. Why Thailand? In northern part of China, because this kind of graduates, they speak Mandarin very well, of course, English proficient. They also, just like your good self, is a genius in languages. They speak Korean and Japanese. Why? Because Thailand is close to Japan and also South Korea. So the banker in Japan, in Singapore, is looking for those kind of people. They can master high-level skill, very good communications, skill, plus language abilities, but cheap in the labor market globally. And I personally, when interview people in Asia, other multinational companies, they all said to me a lot of competitions among the graduates. Even some firms in Hong Kong appointing trainees for banks or multinational companies. There are a huge number of applications. And those graduates applying for the trainees position, many of them are Chinese or Indians having the overseas qualifications, but well connected to the country and also the region. So when Hong Kong students, they're born in Hong Kong, they really complain this day, they really found this very problematic when India and Chinese, students having high quality, qualification, now they compete very well in the world. So, this is the kind of, anxiety among those, developing economy and developing economy like Taiwan and Hong Kong, and also partially account for the student movement in Taiwan recently, about 2 years ago, and most recently in Hong Kong, about the umbrella movement. A lot of, younger generation, they don't see their future. They are not very happy about the competition being, imposed on them because of the open market. So we are facing about this kind of rise of high-skilled but low-paid job offered on the market by the developing economy, and they are no longer low-skilled. They are offering high-skilled but a reasonable price. And the same also happens not only in Europe, contracting out services elsewhere. In China, we are finding similar, situation. Being the world factory in the world, China now tries to exploit cheaper labor elsewhere in order to sustain the world, factory. So we see that, China will in other developing or less developing economies by exploring the labor markets there. So at a global level, you see that this kind of, market change in the labor force has attracted a lot of attention. My friend, I quote your work, a global auction. Certainly, it happens in Asia now, because some of the medium, size economies are no longer cheap enough, and it imposes a huge competition for the knowledge and also positional, competition. And what makes the situation even worse is to put in marketization and privatization in a higher education system. And we are facing squeezing on higher education. Well, on the one hand, we see national government or public to spend more on higher education. Why? Because many of Asian governments, they believe they have to make sure some universities under their remit could be compete globally, because they are all influenced by the intensification of competition about university league tables or ranking. So they have to select a few public universities to groom these universities to become world-class, no matter how you term this and define it. But at the same time, we see the intensification of inequality in education, because many of the students, they cannot get into the public university or the top lead public university. They have to go for private universities. Take, for example, just give you a regional pattern. Most of the students in Asia, when they enjoy higher education, they are paying for higher education, because the massification of higher education in Asia is privately dominated, in my opinion. Say, for example, Japan and Korea, the enrollment rate is about 80%. But most of the universities in Japan and Korea, they are private universities. Taiwan, around over 95% students from high school, they enroll in university this day. But 160 universities, over 100 universities, they are private. The government has to invest, but the government just involved themselves in investing in the selected field to make sure this selected field, they perform well in the world league table. Taking the case of China, Tsinghua and Peking University will be the two. No matter how Zhejiang University have to try that I'm serving Zhejiang University, it won't be the number one and number two, sorry. Under the pecking order, it's only be the third or the fourth one. If you have to look into Fudan, it's another one for competition. Why? Because this is a national strategy to make sure a few universities, publicly funded, they can perform in the world, standing. And it gives us if we put this picture into consideration, what I'm trying to argue is how many students from the system can get into these top niche universities? Only a few. Especially if you do not have the right kind of relationship, or if you are not rich enough to nurture your children in Asia you will be finding it very difficult to get into public university, the top one. Why? And there's another, my friend Mark Bray at HKU have been doing research about private tutoring. If you look into the research findings, so private tutoring is so significant in Asian system. Why? Because parents and families, they are very keen to make sure they can send their kids to the public university, the top each one. So if you guys want to embark a business in Asia, education, private tutoring would be the one. If you go to Taipei, there's a Taipei near the Taipei station. Every evening about 9 o'clock, 9:30, you see a huge crowd of students wearing their uniform coming out. For what? After their tutorial classes. Every Monday to Friday and morning Saturday. And South Korea has the same. So you explain to us that, marketization and privatization certainly shift the cost to the students and parents by raising the tuition fee. But what makes the situation worse is, for those families, they are poor enough, they have invested more in education, but they fail to, supply private tutoring, and their son or daughter cannot get into the very top public university. It creates a kind of tension about public and private university. But don't misunderstand me that there are no good private university in Asia. There are a few, but they are very selective. Like in the case of South Korea, Yonsei University, Korean University, they are very top university on the world table, but only a few families, they are rich enough, they can send their kids to. So this is certainly, to throw the light on the argument that I'm making today is government invests more in higher education in Asia in general, but only for a selected, field in public universities. But parents and students or individuals, they have to pay more for having higher education, but not necessarily get the returns. And it is OECD data suggesting that, more proportion of graduates. And in Asia, the same. If you compare East Asia and the Pacific with other regions, this figure gives you the idea that expansion does take place in East Asia and the Pacific. And looking into the different part of the world, again, this figure shows you very clearly, East Asia and the Pacific has a steady increase in the expansion. And they are supported by, in the case of China, non-government, higher education institutions. Many of them go for private. They don't call it private. They call it 民办, people-run university or colleges. And a lot of students being enrolled, last 20 years. And the red line is China, when compared to the world average, again, project a very steady increasing trend in terms of the enrollment rate. And not only within China, by having the opportunities being offered by the local universities. It gives you this slide about Chinese students studying abroad, including here many of the Chinese students are from Asia. And in the old days, we're talking about overseas students from China, we are talking about scholarship holder. But now, this is no longer the case. Many of the students, they're self-paying, they are based upon the family's support. And not to say only sending out students abroad in the case of China, we are also talking about a trend of transnational higher education program being operated in China. And why? Locally, government in China has spent more on higher education. That means local provision is increasing, but it's not sufficient enough to meet the pressing demand. Or parents are not 100% happy about the local provision. They go for other alternatives, taking the route sending a student out, as I mentioned before, but also enrolling into transnational programs offered by overseas campuses in China in terms of program. But next slide is even interesting. It's about offshore, campuses being, launched in China. Taking the case of Nottingham, Ningpo. When you talk to students or friends or your friends' kids, where they graduate, they will tell you Nottingham. You have to make sure which one. Nottingham, Ningpo, or Nottingham, Malaysia, or the real one in Nottingham here. So they are having, campuses there. I interviewed the rector of the University of Nottingham in Ningpo. It's truly interesting. I had an assumption that they may face the challenge about academic freedom. But the Nottingham friends told me they do not have any problem. But the better way in managing the university is in Ningpo, because in Nottingham, UK, they have difficulty in managing student behavior like drunken people. But in China, they just leave it to the party secretary to take care of it. And they just take care about the academic dimension, running a British program, okay, and teaching the student in English. And the student and graduate I interviewed from the Nottingham Ningpo, they are truly enthusiastic because they enjoy alternative education in China. But bear in mind, they pay higher fee, okay, in enrolling into the Nottingham Ningpo University. Here, give you the idea about, not only offshore, program being run in China, but also offshore campuses. Like another case study that I interviewed is very interesting. NYU, New York University also operated another campus in China, Shanghai, working with the East China Normal University. They can take care about the curriculum. They enjoy the autonomy. But they just leave the student matter and management to the party secretary. And these are other examples like Shanghai Jiao Tong Liverpool, like the Duke, Kunshan, and also Chinese University of Hong Kong has just set up a Shenzhen University branch campus there, and also United International College from Hong Kong, Baptist University working with BNU, Beijing Normal University, for having a campus in Zhuhai. So I want to summarize about, there are different pathways creating the opportunity for Chinese students to enjoy higher education these days, the local provision by the state universities, the Minban University, the private one in China, and if they are not happy, they can send the students outside China, or they enroll them into transnational program, or else they send them into the transnational program being offered, as an offshore program by foreign universities in China. And what does it mean then? They spend a lot on expenditure on studying abroad or a transnational program. Looking into the figure from New Oriental Group by 2013, so many money being spent on, not only from higher education. Some, they even send their kids starting from early education. So you come to the conclusion that education in Asia or other part of the world, increasing cost per students. And the increasing cost for higher education certainly suggests about, in Asia, in higher education is an increasing privateness. As I mentioned about, they are all going through privatization and marketization processes, because in the old days, they listened to the World Bank advice, especially in the case of China and some developing economy. And when they invited World Bank to do the review, World Bank advised them to make use of the privatization strategies in running higher education. And so many of the universities in Asia, they are going through privatization by giving more importance to the private sector in running higher education, and at the same time they also cooperate and also incorporate the university. Take the case about Singapore, it's very interesting. Singapore used to have the national universities, but now they turn the university incorporated, running the university just like a market by injecting market principles and idea to run universities these days in order to make sure they can compete globally. In the old days, the government in Singapore controlled everything in the university finance, but now they enjoy far more freedom, but at the same time, they also have to enhance the competition among university sector. And this slide gives you the idea about many of the systems in the world. They are driven by private sector, particularly the selected Asian countries. But whether, the question is, come to another point that whether privatization of higher education by creating more opportunity for students would really meet the market needs in the labor force. So because of the time, I just focus on labor market in China. It's an interesting transformation. I would argue China can offer us a textbook case going through the expansion of higher education has an implication on labor market and also social mobility. In the old days, before the economic reform started in 1970, people would argue, under the planned economy, there was no problem about unemployment. It reminded me in 1997 when I started doing something about employment issue in China. I had to work with my Beijing team, and my Beijing team tell me, Ka Ho, you don't declare your identity. I just share with the interviewees that you came from, Guangdong. Of course, I came from Guangdong. And research ethically, I could not declare that, I belong to China at that time, because this is before 1997. It's very interesting that the team talked to a lot of universities and also the state-owned enterprises. They all thought that, China could not survive with the WTO coming. And they all thought that, in the old days, that was good because no one would face unemployment. Because this is under work unit assignment, Danwei. This is the work unit arrangement. In the urban area, you were assigned a job, and this is a lifelong employment. Similar situation can be found in South Korea and Japan, where major firms, appoint people in the old days, is a lifelong employment. It's no longer the case. So in the old days, before economic reform in China, seniority contributed mostly in the wage determination. So a group of colleagues mentioned wage was suppressed in January because in the old days, an egalitarian regime. At the early phase of market economy, 1980s and early phase of 1990s, and we found the evidence with data returns to education has been increasing. Since early 2000s, this trend has been flat, probably due to the expansion of higher education as suggested by a group of colleagues in China. And this data gives you the idea in the early days, returns to education increased, but it becomes flat. Okay, when more and more, universities offering more and more, educational opportunity. Not only locally, as I mentioned, those students going overseas or enrolling themselves in transnational program or jumping into the transnational campuses that I just alluded to. So it certainly, suggests similar development emerging in the case of China when compared to the situation in Europe. So would it be the case that expansion in higher education will lead to mobility? And this figure gives you the idea that this is not the case. So almost no change with regard to the individual social position in Mao era. My friend working in Stanford University, Andrew Walter, argued earlier on, in the earlier phase of economic reforms, a dual pathway. Individuals with superior education, earlier on they became professional elites. But if you are having educational credential with party membership, you were administrative elites in the earlier phase of economic reform. But this, argument is now under severe challenge. Higher education has increasingly played a greater role in making a person enter into the professional elite in the reform periods. But I think this, statement needs to be qualified because the world has become more complex. Because when Andrew and his team argued that, at that point, China did not have so many opportunities for higher education. But bear in mind, my friends, if you know China well, from 1998, Zhang Zimian mentioned about further expansion and the quest for world-class university, and China has entered the massified phase. If you go to major cities in China, they are even talking about universalization of higher education. If you adopt the definition of Martin Troll's one, over 50 and 60% already. There is not sort of opportunity in Shanghai. You can find a lot of graduates from high school getting in university, about 60, 70% now. But the national average is 24%. It's still something, is huge. But according to 2010, there's an education blueprint published by the Chinese government. They want to, according to the strategic plan, by 10 years later, would jump up from 24 national average now to 40%. It's really something, am I right? I just cite you one figure. In the last 2 years, Chinese university graduate at least over 7 million each year. Graduates. 7 million to me is particularly meaningful. Why? Because Hong Kong's population is around 7 million. You just imagine, they graduate over 7 million university graduates, just like the total size of Hong Kong waiting for jobs. I think it's a huge issue. Despite the fact that the government in China argue they have, not full employment, as employment is not an issue. So in my recent research, I conducted university students research in Taipei, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong based on city-level analysis. Well, because time is running, so I just present one of the issues. I asked them, do they think about, upward mobility as they perceive? Many of them of Guangzhou, a student told me they found that it is very difficult this day, even in Guangzhou. In Hong Kong, of course, many of the students agree with the statement that the channels for college students to have upward mobility are becoming narrower than before, particularly before the 96, 97. And similar situation can be easily found in the case of Taipei. So if you look into China, the graduate employment, this is interesting. Of course, they graduate so many students. From this end to another end, social about a very significant increase of graduates, but employment rate is around 72% according to the government. But if you look into the earlier on 1996, the rate is fluctuating. But this is the government figure. I just wonder whether this is true. And it depends on how they calculate about the employment. And when I talk to a lot of university students in China, they have jobs, but they are not the job they prefer, or the job they do not require university qualifications. Of course, from the MOE Ministry of Education's point of view, their issue is having job for students, for graduates. But many of them complain that they don't want to go back home, the town, rural area. There are jobs in second-tier cities or rural area, but many of the students enrolling themselves in the major university, they are at the coastal area, the cities, they are reluctant to go back, to the home places for job. So these are the issues. And this one gives you the graduate employment again. Many of students looking for study abroad or self-employed, and quite a number of students preparing for further study without a job, as indicated here. Put all these figures together, and this is only an overview, as I mentioned, because I won't go into the major data set, national data set, and there is no comprehensive and systematic data set as such in China. But I would like to come up with some tentative suggestion about this piece of research. So higher education are likely to lead in many countries, and no one would stop expanding higher education. There's a belief that and students enrolling in higher education at the end of the day, they will become better, and they are more competitive in the global marketplace. But this kind of argument needs qualification. Well, people may argue that I'm too pessimistic, as you may be making the similar kind of observation. But I really want to warn Asian system, especially it took me to remind me a group of delegation from Indonesia. They came to my university last year when we had a conference on massification of higher education. In Indonesia, it's interesting, case here I want to share with you. Now they are having about 18% of the high school graduate being admitted to university. They try to benchmark regionally, and also they want to learn from the American model because America is so successful. College degree holder constitute a lot of population. They are thinking about, in order to strengthen the competitiveness of Indonesia, they have to expand higher education. So after the conference delegation, one of the chap asked me my advice. I asked them about if you allow having 18% higher education enrollment, how about your job market? They told me in private they are facing unemployment already, 18%. But they are planning to expand that up to 60%. Why 60%? Because they benchmark the region. Most of the Asian system in terms of enrollment is at least 60%. So they try to expand that. So my advice is, well, you must be very careful. And it very much depends on what sort of degree you are talking about, and whether the government, particularly the public money, is available and sufficient enough to make sure the educational opportunity is open for all. If not, if you are banging the door of parents or individuals, just like other Asian societies have done by marketizing and privatizing higher education, it may come to a challenge that we just been talking about. So we are talking about more differentiation in returns to degree by institution and the field of study. And certainly getting into the problematic situation that, we are stratifying universities this day, particularly under the context about university ranking and the uneven distribution of wealth or uneven distribution of resources for public university and private university. And we are facing about stratifying not only institutions, but at the end of the day, as educators, we must be very aware about the possibility in turning our students into different classes of students in the local community. Are we talking about stratifying our students into different forms of citizenship? Are we talking about, we are promoting, divisions among our student body, especially when they found that income inequality has become a daily vocabulary among the younger professionals and younger population. So the declining benefit of degrees in many countries, in my opinion, is likely to make some prospective students begin to think about the role of education, particularly whether they have to spend much in higher education. The point that we, as a community of educators, we have to reflect upon ourselves what sort of university education we are making, and what sort of learning experience that we are creating for our students. And whether we have to produce so many graduates, they are only obtaining general skill or general degrees. Especially in Asia, they all are thinking about world-class university. When measuring world-class university, I hate to say that, many governments in Asia, they just adopt the standardization of measurements without differentiation. But don't misunderstand that, I don't support higher education. We need to have higher education, but what sort of learning experience, what kind of, universities education, and what sort of role differentiation and division of labor among the university sector. And at the same time, we should not only take education alone without thinking about the match between education and the labor market needs. And what makes the situation in Asia really problematic is because many of the Asian economies, they want to transform economically, but they are not so successful going through the economic restructuring. So they failed to create different kind of job markets, okay, vis-a-vis university education. They are too traditional because many of the universities, they try to become world-class by adopting the same standardization format. This is really problematic. And this effect rather is likely to be an increasing positional competition among our undergraduates for the best courses at the best universities. Again, as I mentioned to you, privatization of higher education takes place in Asia, certainly reinforce about the inequality because only a few very top-rich students they can get into public universities. And those kids, many of them come from middle class or upper class family because their family can afford to pay them whole-day private tutoring. And for those poor families, they suffer for getting into a public university at the first place, but they spend more on private tutoring, private education. But at the end, they find less attractive, future opportunities. So I conclude, likely by my friend talking about opportunity trap. The trap points to increasing social congestion for decent jobs as people scramble for highly wage school, colleges, and jobs. And I look at my height. I certainly think that this is something, opportunity trap. I always tiptoe myself, but when everyone tiptoes, I cannot see anything. But if I don't tiptoe myself, I find it difficult. I may lose any opportunity. So I just paraphrase that. This is the situation that many Asian university students are facing now. They all jump into the opportunity, but whether the opportunities are open for them, whether the opportunities could really lead them and land them into better opportunities elsewhere. And higher education expansion in Asia has, challenged the conventional wisdom that, the human resource capital theory talk about at some point there's a return, but this is under severe challenge. And also, I want to conclude by saying, by summarizing that most approaches to social justice in and through higher education are based on common sense notion of social justice, which typically assume a distributive framework. That not only ignores, but more importantly, hides and disguises critical institutional analysis of domination and oppression. Family, intergenerational transfer of assets, parents' involvement are crucial, factor determining about people's educational opportunities and experience. So this dominant distributive paradigm defines social justice as the morally proper distribution of social benefits and burdens among society's members. I quote my friend Michael Young's work. But I argue this approach is rendered inappropriate when education has failed to serve such a distributive function, especially when social justice is generated and maintained through particular form of social relations, which I point to family, intergenerational transfer of resources, in particular as they are experienced in the voluntarization of higher education knowledge. So I want to end my presentation by citing the work of my good friend Susan Robertson and Roger Dale from Bristol. They argue education governance frameworks structurally and strategically select particular interests, which in turn distribute more or less unequal social opportunities and outcomes, and therefore the basic structure. And this places responsibilities on those who are particularly advantaged by them societal interests. It also means that we scrutinize concentrations of power and create new modes of accountability and space for representation, politics within and beyond the national stage. So, end quote. So I think this piece of work just raised some kind of, concern. I must confess that, we certainly need more, comprehensive data that my team and I have been working on. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the more I do the research in Asia, I must confess that I know little, because the more I expose myself to different kind of empirical world doing the field work, every time I find something interesting and new. And so that's why I remain active in being a humble researcher. I hope that I learn from your comments and questions, and I also look forward to work with the team, a very distinguished team here at Bath University, and we can work together to promote more dialogue between Asia and Europe. And I commit myself to your Vice Chancellor about international collaboration. I hope that this is a point of departure that we can enable to have more collaboration. Thank you very much.